Welcome to Irish Poetry. I'm Dr. Patrick McFarlane, and I'm going to look today at Seamus Heaney's poem The Forge. I'll start by reading the poem out. I'll then offer an explanation of the poem's meaning, and finally we'll look at the form of the poem. The Forge. All I know is a door into the dark. Outside, old axles and iron hoops rusting. Inside, the hammered anvil's short-pitched ring, the unpredictable fantail of sparks, or hiss when a new shoe toughens in water. The anvil must be somewhere in the centre, horned as a unicorn, at one end square, set there immovable, an altar where he expends himself in shape and music. Sometimes, leather-aproned, hairs in his nose, he leans out on the jamb, recalls a clatter of hoofs where traffic is flashing in rows, then grunts and goes in, with a slam and a flick, to beat real iron out, to work the bellows. This poem is a portrait of a blacksmith, someone who works with metal, beating it into different shapes, like horseshoes. And the forge to which the title refers is the building in which the blacksmith works. Heaney was thinking of a specific forge near where he grew up in rural County Derry, Northern Ireland, and of its owner, Barney Devlin. In the first line of the poem, the speaker situates himself outside the forge, looking in. It seems to be daytime, and by comparison with the street, the inside of the building is shrouded in darkness. We sense that the speaker may feel ignorant or even excluded from the work going on inside. In the second line, we see, outside the forge, perhaps propped against the wall, old axles, which are parts of a cart or wagon, the straight poles that connect the wheels together, and iron hoops, which are the equivalent of tires that protect the wooden wheels from damage. These axles and hoops are rusting outside the forge because they've been left there for a long time, exposed to the elements. Heaney's image suggests that the activities for which the forge might previously have been useful, making axles and hoops for carts drawn by horses, might be passing away because new technologies have replaced them. It's helpful to know here that this poem was first published in 1969. In line 3, the speaker hears the sound of ringing coming from inside the forge. This is because the blacksmith is striking his hammer against the anvil, or bench, as he beats metal into shape. The term short-pitched conveys the dull, thudding sound that this makes, as opposed to the prolonged resonance of a bell. The speaker then sees an arc of sparks coming off the hot metal as it's beaten. He compares the fleeting pattern made by these sparks to the appearance of the tail of a bird, called the fantail, which itself is named for its resemblance to a handheld paper fan. The speaker also hears the sound of a hot horseshoe being plunged into a bucket of water to harden the metal. These lines show that the speaker has some idea of what is happening in the forge, but only some. In particular, he cannot see anything beyond a few sparks. And that's why an important shift occurs in the poem between lines 5 and 6. We go from seeing directly through the speaker's eyes to following him into his imagination. We know this from the word must, which indicates that the speaker is making an assumption rather than speaking from experience. Barney Devlin, the blacksmith, observed that Heaney hadn't crossed the threshold into his particular forge, which is shown there on the right, before writing this poem. The fact that we are now in the world of the imagination is underlined by the use of the word unicorn in line 7. The speaker compares the pointed end of the anvil to the horn of that mythical creature, suggesting that the anvil is more a figment of the imagination than reality, but also lending it some of the unicorn's magical properties. This anvil is said to be immovable, which emphasizes its toughness, and supports the subsequent metaphor by which the anvil is compared to a stone altar. The altar is the table on which the most important ritual in Christianity is performed, that of the priest offering the Eucharist as a sacrifice. Together, these terms give a sense of permanence and mystery to the blacksmith's work. Both blacksmith and priest are concerned with shape or form, that of metalwork on the one hand, and the body and blood of Christ on the other. They are also connected by music, the sound of tools hitting metal, and the singing of the liturgy. However, the term expends brings out a contrast between the gentleness with which a priest consecrates the Eucharist and the force with which the blacksmith does his work. We have come to the end of another sentence, and another important change in the poem occurs as we move into line 10. Lines 6 to 9 are concerned primarily with describing the imagined anvil, but now the speaker turns his attention directly to the blacksmith. He's shown wearing a leather apron, which might make us think of the priest's chasuble, a sort of embroidered apron worn when celebrating the Eucharist, and he's described as having hairs in his nose. These hairs emphasize the blacksmith's age and experience, and perhaps also the speaker's youth and inexperience. We already have some impression of this from the poem's opening lines. His imagined ability to see up the blacksmith's nose suggests that he may be shorter and so younger. The speaker then imagines the blacksmith leaning out on the jamb, the upright part of the forge's doorframe, and remembering a sound. This involves a further imaginative leap. The speaker is imagining the blacksmith remembering, but it also suggests a connection between the two figures. The blacksmith is using his imagination, just like the speaker. The sound of clattering hooves in line 12 brings us back to the image of rusting axles and hoops from line 2, and the image of rows of fast-moving traffic, with metal bodywork flashing or glinting in the sun, confirms our sense that technology has moved on. Horses and carts have been replaced by motorized vehicles, and the blacksmith's trade must be fading as a result. But the blacksmith doesn't seem to be, or show that he is, defeated. He simply grunts and returns into the forge to continue his work, perhaps slamming the door against the sight of the traffic. In doing so, he slams the door in the face of the speaker, keeping the mysteries within hidden. Of course, this doesn't defeat the speaker either, since he is using his imagination to conjure up these images. He concludes by envisaging the blacksmith continuing to beat iron and work the bellows, which are tools for pushing more air into the furnace that he uses to heat metal. To summarize the poem then, we have a speaker standing outside a blacksmith's forge, seeing and hearing a little from this vantage point, and then using his imagination to describe the rest, from the anvil to the blacksmith himself. The imagined blacksmith recalls the world of his youth and continues with his work, despite technological changes that have diminished the need for it. That's one explanation for the narrative of the poem, but it has another important layer of meaning. In any given poem, the speaker is not always identifiable with the poet, but he is in this case. This is suggested by the speaker's use of his creative powers when imagining the interior of the forge and the inner life of its owner, and by his apparent feeling of detachment from these spaces. The speaker, the poet, seems respectful of the blacksmith's evident experience and dedication to his craft, but perhaps also a little jealous of the blacksmith for working with what Heaney calls real iron, as opposed to immaterial ideas and words. At the same time, as I mentioned in relation to line 11, the speaker presents connections between the work of the blacksmith and that of the poet. This might seem confusing, especially given the other comparison to the work of the priest, but we might see it as a natural consequence of the speaker's wish to lessen the detachment he feels from the blacksmith. Like the blacksmith, The poet expends himself in shape and music, through the poem's structure, rhythms, and sound patterns. Both blacksmith and poet are engaged in traditional craft work. As we'll see, Heaney underlines this by choosing a traditional form for the poem. And both craft traditions are facing challenges. The blacksmiths from motorization, and the poets from new theories that had emerged in the 1950s and 60s, which called into question the ethics of the Western literary tradition. This seems like a good moment to turn to form. The Forge is structured as a sonnet, which is to say that it consists of 14 lines and has a change in mood in the second half of the poem. Usually this change would happen in a sonnet after line 8, so by putting it after line 9, Heaney is diverging from tradition. The rhyme scheme of the poem also diverges as it unfolds. It starts with the conventional ABBA, then continues CCDC instead of the more usual CDDC. However, the final 6 lines break the pattern more radically. EFCFEF. This differs from established forms in several ways, but the most striking is the use of a rhyme from the first 8 lines in the final 6. This links the two sections together in a way that they are usually not. As mentioned, the imaginative effort made by the speaker undergoes a step change after line 9, as he shifts from guessing at the appearance of the anvil to the thoughts of the blacksmith. This requires not only creative ability, but what Heaney presents as the more advanced power of empathy. Such a power is transformative, allowing the poet to melt and refashion the sonnet form, just as the blacksmith does with metal, and the priest does with bread and wine. However, as the linking C rhyme shows, between water, centre, and altar on the one hand, and clatter on the other, these two powers are closely linked. Just as the poet's power of imaginative description is connected to that of stepping into another's shoes, so the blacksmith's power of memory, of remembering the clatter of hooves, is linked by rhyme to the priest-like power of transformation that he demonstrates at the altar of his anvil. I will round off by observing another connection that Heaney makes between poet and blacksmith. As I have said, the poem undergoes a change between lines 9 and 10, from imaginative description to empathy, but also between lines 5 and 6, from observation to imaginative description. This divides up the poem symmetrically, with the description of the anvil at its centre. Just as the anvil is at the centre of the forge, so the anvil is at the centre of the poem. This, I suggest, is the ultimate solution that Heaney finds to the sense of exclusion implied in line 1. Stuck out in the street, he creates his own one-room cabin, the site of complex transformational work just as powerful as the blacksmith's, a forge by any other name. And that concludes this analysis of The Forge by Seamus Heaney. Thank you for watching, and it would be great if you could click the like button below.